So let's talk through every single element of Warhammer 40k datasheets in 10th edition, each stat characteristic and section, and what it means in-game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k datasheets, and continuing our series of how to play Warhammer 40k 10th edition. So far in the series we've covered what you need to play a basic game of Warhammer 40k, then gone through the turn sequence blow by blow, covering the command, movement, shooting, charge and fight phases, plus a video on weapon keywords. I'll leave a link to the full How to Play 10th edition series down in the video description as a playlist. In this video though, I thought we'd talk through Warhammer 40k datasheets, which bring a lot of the stats and characteristics that you need in the other phases all together. Literally talk through each aspect of the datasheet and what it means in game, perhaps with a little bit of commentary as to what you can normally expect throughout Warhammer 40k in general. We'll go through the core of the datasheets in this video, and then talk about some oddball units and datasheets in the next one, focusing on things like flyers, transports, and leader units. Jumping into it though, and datasheets in Warhammer 40k can be found in a fair few places. These are the unit profiles that tell you what things you can take on your unit, and then the statistics and rules for the weapons and the unit in game, with the numbers for the unit's damage and defensive profiles, plus any special rules they might have in addition. There's going to be a fair few places that you can find datasheets in Warhammer 40k as the edition goes on. For all of the factions that don't have codexes yet, the place to look will be the index download section in Warhammer Community. That's found on the Warhammer Community website under Downloads and 40k Downloads, and they come in big PDFs detailing every single unit for each faction. You also might have the option to buy physical copies of these index cards, though Games Workshop doesn't look like they're keeping a lot of these in stock permanently. Can be fairly nice and tactile if you can get your hands on them, though they tend to be a bit less updated than the digital ones, and they might have some misprinted errors. Then as each faction gets their codex released throughout 10th edition 40k, the datasheets will be in that, and you can also find the same information via the Warhammer 40k app, though presented a little bit differently. That's both a paid subscription to Warhammer Plus and also needing codex codes to unlock the full information, so it's maybe a little bit of a pricey option. There are various places that have unofficial third-party rule sources as well, things like Battlescribe and Warhapedia when they update to the current rule set. There could certainly be other useful places to get the same information. Just for the basics of the data cards and the datasheets before we get into the specifics, these generally have two sides to them, printed next to each other in the PDFs, though they're on the front and the back if you buy any physical index cards. They're not really titles as such, but really they have an army construction side where they basically tell you how to set up your units and what choices you need to make for them pre-game, and then a side that's more focused on the actual in-game that you'll probably use when you're actually on the tabletop, detailing their stat line, weapon profiles, and special rules and things. While they have the vast majority of the information for fielding each unit in Warhammer 40k, they don't contain points costs. These are typically found in the Munitorum Field Manual, though you can use the Warhammer app as well. The Field Manual document is another one that you can download from the Warhammer Community webpage, again in the download section and under 40k downloads. The reason they keep them separate is that they might update points values a bit more regularly than any sort of datasheet rules. That way they just need to reissue the field manual and not have to actually reprint every single datasheet in the game. Taking a look at a datasheet though, and for our example today I thought we'd look at the Chaos Terminator squad. Big hulking armoured elites of the Chaos Space Marines with a whole load of armour and spikes and armed with combi weapons and power weapons. This is the army construction side of their data card. We'll talk through this before going on to their stat lines, and they also get the unit title and a little bit of flavour text about them, explaining the unit and its role within the 40k universe. Talking through the elements, and they've got a unit composition bit on the right here. You can take 1 Terminator Champion and 4 to 9 standard Chaos Terminators. Sometimes the title of the models can be a little bit important for which war gear they can be armed with in the options. Some things might specify, say, a regular Terminators as opposed to the Champion. Technically, as per these rules, you could field the squad in any number between 5 and 10, though the way that Games Workshop has chosen to run the point system in Warhammer 40k 10th edition means that in practice you only really ever want to field them in squads of 5 or 10 and not in between. Looking at their points cost in the Munitorum Field Manual, and for 5 models you have to pay 195 points for them, and 10 you have to pay 390. If you take anything in between you'd have to pay the higher cost of 390, so it will be a bit inefficient. This bit on the right also details what the base loadout is. It says that every model here is equipped with a combi bolter and an accursed weapon as their base choices, and then they have some war gear options on the left here to decide what you want to swap those out with, if anything. Moving on to the war gear options section here, and the Chaos Terminators have really quite a lot of options. It gives you a bullet pointed list of things that you can swap out from one model or another, and it tells you how many you can do so. Say for example, for every 5 models in the unit, you can replace one combi bolter with a heavy weapon, either a heavy flamer or a Reaper autocannon in this case. You can swap out any of the combi bolters with combi weapons which have slightly different rules with mortal wounds against infantry, and a whole load of them can take power fists and one a chain fist. In 10th edition, with their simple point system, then all these upgrades are free. You no longer have to pay any points for them as you did in previous editions of the game. It often means that squads with a lot of options like this generally want to take a fair bit of the most exciting gear, though obviously not every single upgrade is going to be a direct upgrade. Some weapons or rules might have different trade-offs between different targets that you might be fighting. For example, taking the option to trade out those combi bolters for combi weapons is going to make them worse against a whole load of targets, aside for things like super elite infantry. Then at the bottom of the datasheet you've got the unit keywords. These are printed on both sides, as they're useful to know both in game and in army construction. On the bottom right you've got the faction keyword, which is Heretic Astartes in this case. Heretic Astartes is the faction keyword for Chaos Space Marines units, and typically in army construction you have to have this keyword be the same for all units, barring things that have special rules like certain allies. A lot of faction rules might key off this keyword as well. There could be rules that specify that they have to be used on Heretic Astartes units and nothing else. Next to the faction keyword you also have the basic keywords for the unit as well. These can be really quite varied and encompass really quite a lot of stuff. They usually start with the basic keywords for the way that the unit works, if it's either an infantry, mounted model, vehicle or monster, as they all have different rules with interaction with terrain, and might be relevant for things like big guns never tire when shooting in combat, basically the default way that the unit activates in game. Then you might have some keywords that don't really do a whole load besides for other things within the faction, say the Terminator keyword. One reason that's relevant for Chaos Space Marines is determining what transports they can ride in and how many transport slots they take up in those. They can ride in a Land Raider, but they take up 2 transport slots if they do so. There's an absolute ton of others, both generic ones and faction-specific ones. Other common ones could be Fly, for determining how things move in the movement and charge phase rules. You might have things with a character keyword, particularly for leaders joining units. There's some things that activate generic stratagems, like say having grenades means that you can access that stratagem and throw some mortal wounds around up close if it makes sense. And you might have the Psyker keyword if you're, say, a Space Marine Librarian or Chaos Sorcerer or something. Might be relevant for some rules within your own faction, or might be relevant for rules like the anti-keyword. Say some things wound vehicles or infantry on easier mounts, so it's more relevant for enemy weapons targeting your unit than the other way around. Finally, there's a few more things that might appear on this army construction side, besides things that the Chaos Terminators show off. They might have transport capacity for certain transport vehicles, like say this Death Guard Rhino. It tells you that you can transport 12 Death Guard infantry, but not Terminator, Cultist or Poxwalker keyword models. And you can also see it's got a fair few different keywords here, both the vehicle, dedicated transport, smoke to allow that stratagem, and also being aligned to Nurgle. If a character can lead a unit here, then it's also specified on this side. Say for example Typhus can lead either the Blightlord Terminators, Deathshroud Terminators or Poxwalkers. That means they can attach to one of those units and functionally become one unit for the rest of the game. We'll talk about transports and leaders in the next video. Flipping over the Chaos Terminator squad though, and you get to the more in-game side with the stats and characteristics for the squad. Broadly speaking, this is usually the thing that you need to reference in-game in Warhammer 40k. If you can't remember, say, a certain statistic for a weapon or how many wounds a model has or something like that, this is where you find out. There's really quite a lot here, so we'll just break things down one by one. The vast majority of this is stuff that we've already talked about throughout the turn sequence, but it's perhaps kind of useful to talk through all of it for just one unit. First up in the top left, the movement is the movement characteristic in inches, how far the unit can move when it makes a move, and no part on the model can move further than this, so you can't do weird power slide shenanigans of vehicles, or measure front to back with the model's base gaining the amount of distance of that. If you advance, then it might be this number plus d6, making them go a lot faster at the expense of shooting or fighting. The Terminators have a movement of 5, which is kind of slow due to their heavy armour. Standard infantry tend to move around 6 inches, most monsters and vehicles tend to move somewhere around about 8 to 12. Then we've got the model's toughness characteristic. This is the one that depends on how easily certain weapons can damage them. You attack with a strength characteristic and you roll off against the model's toughness characteristic as per the table, depending on whether you're better, twice as better, equal or worse. Toughness 5 isn't too bad for infantry, means that a lot of small arms like bolt guns will wound them on a 5+, which is kind of nice. Next up is the model's saving throw. This is recorded as a number plus, so the amount that you need to roll on a single dice to pass the save and save the model from taking any damage. The Terminators have a very big chunky 2+ save, so shrugging off the vast majority of small arms there. Enemy AP will often be reducing this though, so say if it was AP -2, you'd need to roll a 4+ rather than a 2+, as you've made it 2 worse. And you can have positive modifiers to it with cover, say if they were hit by an AP -2 weapon to make them save on a 4+, but they had cover, that would improve it back to a 3. If they fail a save, then they'll take damage off their wounds characteristic. The Chaos Terminators in particular have a 2+ save, which is as good as it gets. Their armor's very hard for most conventional weapons to take out. Then we have the model's wounds characteristic. The Chaos Terminator squad has 3 wounds, essentially the number of lives it has before it's destroyed, and you reduce this each time the model fails a save and takes some damage. For typical values, light infantry in 40k tend to have 1 wound, heavier infantry maybe somewhere around 2 to 4, and then vehicles and monsters can get bigger and bigger depending on how large they are, perhaps a typical battle tank having somewhere around about 12 wounds. If the Terminator squad fails a save, then you take the damage characteristic of a weapon off the wounds characteristic. If a damage 1 weapon attacks them and they fail 1 save against it, one model will reduce their wounds characteristic down to 2 as he's lost 1 life. If they got hit by a weapon with some massively excess damage, say they failed a save against a big Gauss weapon with a damage characteristic of 6, the excess damage might be lost to overkill. Each attack just lands on 1 model, so even with the excess damage, you'd still just take out 1 Terminator there, and the extra 3 wounds that you'd done over and above the wounds characteristic would be lost. Next up is the model's leadership. This is how likely they are to fail battle shock tests. Lower tends to be better, and in general in 40k this varies all the way between 5+ and 8+, with the vast majority of normal units having either 6 or 7. A fair few things can trigger leadership or battle shock tests for various reasons, but the most normal core way is if you'd have to test it in the command phase and your squad is below half strength. If that were the case for these Terminators, you need to roll 2 dice and get a 6 or more. Usually going to happen most of the time, as Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines tend to be quite brave. If you do fail Battle Shock, they take those penalties. Their objective control stat becomes 0 until their next command phase. They can't use stratagems, and they need to test Desperate Escape if they were falling back. Talking of which, the last stat on their main stat line is their OC, or Objective Control. This one's relevant for units standing on objective markers, which tend to be the way that you win a whole load of missions in Warhammer. For this one, you usually add up the objective control numbers of all models within 3 inches of that marker. If you have at least some objective control points and your opponent has less, then the objective is yours. The actual stat of objective control usually only matters too much if you both got models from your army and the enemy army all on one objective. That would mean that having a high objective control stat would be kind of valuable to try and outcompete your opponent. The Terminators each only have 1 objective control of 1. It tends to usually be either really big stuff or the more sort of troops and battle line infantry that tend to have objective control 2 on their basic units. They might not be the best damage dealers, but they tend to be the best at holding and securing points. And some bigger stuff can have some much higher values as well, say things like Imperial Knights. Then we get on to the weapon profile section. There's a section both for ranged weapons and for melee weapons, and these detail all the ranged or combat weapons that you have the opportunity to arm the squad with. A few factions have a separate data card for more common weapon profiles that appear on lots of multiple units to save them having to reprint. The weapons that you have on each model will be determined by the army construction site, so even if the characteristics are listed, doesn't necessarily mean that you get all of these profiles within one squad or on one vehicle. It depends on the choices that you made for each model. When shooting in 40k, each model typically gets to attack with every ranged weapon that it has equipped. The only exception to that are pistol weapons, which are basically an either-or alternative. You get to make attacks with all of your regular ranged weapons or all of your pistols, not a mix and match of both. Going through a weapon stat line, and say we've got this Reaper autocannon, it has its own stat block, but also has a couple of special rules listed under it. It gets devastating wounds, so 6s to wound will become a mortal wound as per the weapon keyword abilities, and it also has sustained hits 1 as well. That means that any hit rolls of a 6 will generate 1 additional hit, so it's likely to get a few more hits than its attacks and ballistic skill would lead you to believe without that rule. Then you have the weapon ranges. This is the distance in inches for where your unit can target another enemy unit. You measure each of these per model. So say if you had a Chaos Terminator squad with full combi bolters, if some of them were within 24-inch range, then those ones will get to shoot. But if some were outside of that 24-inch range of the unit that you needed to target, they might not be able to fire. Then each weapon has an attack stat. This is how many dice that you get to roll when you make attacks with that weapon. The combi bolter gets 2, so that'd be 2 dice normally, though it would go up to 4 within 12-inch range due to its rapid fire rule. And the Reaper autocannon has a bigger rate of fire with 4. Some of these can be random, particularly torrent or blast weapons. For example, the Heavy Flamer is recorded as D6 attacks, so you just roll one standard 6-sided dice to determine how many attacks that makes, and you do roll that separately for each Heavy Flamer in the unit. Then they have their ballistic skill, what dice roll that you need to succeed to hit with those attacks. Most things in Warhammer 40k tend to hit on either a 3+ or a 4+. There are some elite things that hit on 2s, or orcs hitting on 5s. And the same unit can have different hit values for different weapons. Say the combi weapon on this one hits on a 4+, whereas the other weapons hit on 3s. The Heavy Flamer on this one gets a not applicable, as that one has the torrent special rule, so that one auto hits. Then we've got the strength characteristics of the weapons. Again, these are the characteristics that you'd be wounding against the enemy's toughness with, as per the strength versus toughness chart. I generally consider things like strength 3 to 5 as being kind of low strength in Warhammer 40k, strength 6 to 8 being kind of medium, and then strength 9+ getting into the realm where you might be wounding some vehicles on 4s or 3s, generally a bit better for more dedicated anti-tank weapons. Then each weapon has AP, or an armor penetration value. This is a value that worsens the enemy saving throw, so very important to have some of if you're firing at an enemy with a good save like a 3+ or 2+. It's recorded as a negative modifier, so technically I guess a lower number is better. Things like a -4 or a -3 will be better than a -1 or a 0. Armor penetration doesn't work on invulnerable saves, just on the regular armor saving throw of the unit, and it's cumulative with positive modifiers such as cover, so you might have a save that gets worse due to AP but then gets better again due to cover, making it a sort of mid-value compared with what it was. Then we have the weapon's damage characteristic, how many wounds that it takes off if the enemy fails a save against them. For all of these ranged weapons that the Chaos Terminators get, it's all 1. Some of their power fists in the melee weapon are damaged 2, and generally anti-tank weapons tend to be far higher than this. Some armies might have a Feel No Pain save, which has a chance to mitigate the damage that's inflicted. Then below the ranged weapons we've also got the table of melee weapons. These work very similarly, but as they're melee weapons they can only attack in the fight phase, and when your unit is in engagement range of an enemy unit, and then there's restrictions as to which models can fight as per the fight phase rules. As such, they don't have a range characteristic, and unlike shooting weapons, you typically choose just one of your equipped melee weapons to make an attack with, but otherwise are kind of similar in the way that they work for the most part. Then moving over to the right hand side of the datasheets, there's their abilities. These are typically listed in the order of core abilities first, then faction abilities second, then unit abilities third, I guess in order of generalization. Core abilities are things that are referenced throughout the bulk of the core rules. The Chaos Terminators here have Deep Strike, so that basically means they can teleport into battle and come down anywhere on the table from reserves. Quite a powerful deployment option. But there's all manner of other things that you might see listed here. Feel No Pain for an extra chance to mitigate damage besides your normal save, the Stealth Special rule for a -1 to hit, character protection things like Leader to join squads or Lone Operative so you can't be shot at long range, Deadly Demise, which you often find on vehicles or monsters, the chance to blow up when they die, and then potentially other 4 deployment type options like Scouts or Infiltrators to move into the midfield or to just set up there from the first place. Then after that there's faction abilities. These will be any specific rules that are core to, say, the Heretic Astartes faction in the case of the Chaos Terminator squad, usually just 1 special rule, maybe 2. The Chaos Space Marines get their Dark Pact, a rule where you roll some dice and have the chance to take some mortal wounds, but you do so in exchange for big damage boosts to their weapons. Quite a fun ability and can make them very powerful and very dangerous. You won't find any special rules from the faction's detachment listed here. When the codexes come out, they'll be able to change between detachments, so they might or might not get the special rule depending on which way you've chosen to field your Heretic Astartes army. Then after the generic core rules and the faction special rules are any rules that are just unique to this unit alone. These often tend to be some of the most fun bits for each unit, and almost all units in Warhammer 40k have 1 special rule that's kind of unique to them. They might get similar rules on a few other units within the same faction or across different factions. The Chaos Terminator squad gets the Despoiler special rule, which means that each time it makes a Dark Pact, then it gets additional damage output even above that, as you get to re-roll the hit roll if they do so. That should mean that they're converting the vast majority of their hit rolls, and massively ups the value of making a Dark Pact in the first place, making it a really good deal in the trade-off for their mortal wounds. Different units have all sorts of abilities like this though. It might be extra damage like this, extra defensive rules, debuffs to enemies, interesting interactions with objectives, other ways that they could deploy, and plenty more. I think they're quite an interesting thing to try and keep the different units feel a bit more distinct from each other. Finally, in this section, we also find the model's invulnerable save if they have one. Not all models do, as these are sort of unnatural protection like force fields or demonic saves and things like that. But basically, this is a saving throw that you can use against anything but mortal wounds pretty much. It can't be modified by armor penetration, so even if the Terminator squad got hit by an AP-4 weapon or something big like that, they'd still be able to fall back on this invulnerable save instead. It's not always recorded here. On some units it's listed below the saving throw characteristic, which I think to be honest is maybe a bit more of a logical place for it, and you either get to use either the invulnerable save or the armor save, whichever one is better. You don't get to take one then the other or anything like that. That's more for things like feel no pain. I feel like overall these do feel like really quite a lot of stats and rules to remember, though it does get fairly intuitive once you play a game or two with them. I feel like the actual in-game reference and understanding opponents' units, perhaps some of the most useful stuff to try and understand is what sort of defensive profile they have, so what of your guns are going to be best to kill them, and also try and get a grip of what sort of special rules they might have, as they could potentially lead to some big swings in-game and have some unexpected things happen. In any case, hope you've enjoyed some discussion of Warhammer 40k datasheets in general. Let me know any further questions you might have down in the comments below, or any other things that you might feel like you've missed on datasheets. As mentioned, if you fancy it, feel free to check out the rest of my How to Play Warhammer 40k 10th edition playlist. I'll link that down in the video description, and feel free to subscribe to check back to Auspex Tactics for the next one. I'll try and make that one about covering things like flyers, transports, and leaders. Finally, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way that I can continue to make content like this quite so regularly. If you are finding it useful, any support on the Patreon is massively appreciated. People who back the channel there do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.